So another way that we can begin to get a clearer understanding of what is meant by communication would be to build a model or a visual representation of what we mean by communication. And many scholars have done this, and the models that they build have implications for what it is they're actually going to study. So we can also think of these models of communication as being different ways of looking at communication. Here we see a subway map, and a subway map is a kind of model of the subway. And we can imagine if we were in New York City and we were riding the subway, we could use this subway map to help us understand the subway, get a better sense of what it is. We could also use this subway model to predict what's going to happen, which will be the shortest route that we could take if we were to take it. So a good model can help us predict, and a good model can also help us control our environment. Say we actually wanted to get our body from point A to point B, this model would be very useful for us. Similarly, when we are building communication models, we want them to give us a better understanding of what communication is. We want to use them to help us predict what might happen given certain communication situations. And it might also want to help us control our environment to improve the functioning of our organization or to improve the functioning of our relationship. So models of communication can be very important things, but it's also important to keep in mind that, like this subway model, models are necessarily incomplete and simplified. They have to kind of dumb things down a little bit. They have to leave a lot of things out and simplify things so that the model is something that is meaningful and can be communicated to somebody else. The model also is going to really highlight certain aspects of reality. It's going to include certain things and not include other things. So the model is going to tell us what we should be looking for, but at the same time, it's going to have some weaknesses that it's not going to they won't be able to address. So as we go through these models, we're going to talk about what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of those models. The models we're going to be discussing in the next several videos are the psychological model, which I'll talk about in the remainder of this video, the social constructionist model in an upcoming one, the pragmatic model, and the critical models of communication. So let's begin with the psychological models of communication. I'm going to show you two here in a little bit, but what you need to know about the psychological model is that it views communication as primarily a mental activity of people sending and receiving messages. So it's really interested in how do two people, two minds come up with some sort of shared meaning. And here are two different psychological models that I want you to know. Both of them are talked about in our readings for this week. The psychological model called the linear model is a pretty simple one, and it gives us some key terms for understanding communication. A sender, a receiver. What does a sender do? A sender encodes a message. They craft a message that is able to be sent. That message is then sent along what this model calls a channel, or it could be thought of as a media. That channel could be a spoken channel, the channel of using spoken word. It could be the channel of written communication. It could be a channel of nonverbal communication that the message is traveling along. And the message is then received by the receiver, who decodes that message or makes meaning out of that message. And as long as there's not too much noise or interference from the environment, then that message can be received by the receiver. So this is a basic linear model, and it has a few weaknesses. Primarily, it's showing communication as kind of a one-directional, one-shot. I just send this message off, and boom, it's received. And communication is much more complex than that. So our second psychological model, the transactional model, tries to improve upon the linear model by making it multi-directional, or what we might call transactional here. And also, this model is going to improve upon the linear model because it's going to take into account the role of the context, the physical environment, and the psychological context. What is the situation that's going on? The cultural context of the interaction, the relational, what's the relationship between the people who are communicating, the relational context, the social context, what part of society is this taking place. So the transactional model's an improvement upon the linear model. It shows that communication is kind of co-created in a space between two communicators who are sending and receiving messages and then using the context to help create a sense of what that message means here. Again, this is primarily, though, about two minds trying to figure out what's happening, and that's why I refer to this as a psychological model of communication. But it's definitely improved upon it. Be sure to read about the linear and transactional models in the textbook. So what makes the psychological perspective useful? Well, we can use it to improve upon our messages. It's going to emphasize the importance of crafting messages that our audiences can understand. So it's really focused in on that kind of mental activity of perception and shared understanding. Here's an example of a scholarship that might be taking a psychological perspective. Here's a research question. How do audience members process a political speech that goes against their core beliefs? Okay, so in this study, we're examining how does an audience listen to an argument that's being made in a political speech, an argument that they're already kind of disagreeing with. And we might study that and come to seek to an understanding of how does an audience respond to a message like that. And this is psychological. Psychological scholars who take a psychological perspective tend to take a laws approach, where we're trying to determine a cause and effect relationship between two things. If there is this message, how will the audience react? And I'm going to study the minds of the audience in order to look for more scientific laws about how people think and process information. So we call that a laws approach, and we'll talk more about this in chapter 8 when we're talking about communication theory. But for now, just know that people who take a psychological approach tend to treat the study of communication like science. We're trying to measure the cause and effect of certain things. Some criticisms of the psychological model include that the linear model in particular ignores context and sees meaning more as an individual experience. Meaning is something that occurs in your mind rather than meaning being derived from a cultural situation. So it ignores kind of a cultural level. It looks at just two minds. It's also mechanistic. It's going to treat the act of communicating like a machine. The message is this package that's sent. It assumes that it's not it's possible to not send a message, right? Rather than kind of constantly making sense out of the world around us, it treats communication as if it comes in certain packages and then it can be shut off. So we might not have that view of communication. So that's a quick view of the psychological approach, the psychological view of communication. In the next video, we're going to talk about social constructionist view and hopefully be able to contrast in some ways this view, psychological, and the other views that are coming up.